When people ask me, what happens if we don't do basic income, we're going to get more inequality. And I would say the rising inequality has a lot to do with the fact that we have not been distributing productivity growth through the growth that technology has created and made possible. That's a really key part of it, is just thinking that we do want to go to that better place, and we actually can do it. It's possible. We suffer from a collective lack of will and imagination. It's not like economics holding us back. We could have started a UBI decades ago. We can actually do all kinds of things better than we're doing now.
Welcome back to the Meg and Amy Show. Thank you so much for the support for our show. Please do like and subscribe and add comments. We would love to hear from you and what you'd like to see more of on the show. Today, we're joined by Scott Santens, one of the world's leading voices on universal basic income. Scott has been researching and advocating for UBI since 2013, and here's what makes him unique. He's actually been living it. Since 2015, Scott has crowdfunded his own basic income through Patreon, enabling him to focus full-time on his work. His influence reaches from Andrew Yang's presidential campaign to his role as founder of the Income to Support All Foundation and author of Let There Be Money, which you can actually listen to for free on any podcast platform. Today, we're diving into Scott's journey, from a Reddit thread to becoming UBI's most recognized advocate, why Alaska has been proving this works for 40 years, and why he believes the most radical economic idea might actually be the simplest one. Just give people money. Thanks to Rory for connecting us with Scott. So great to have you here, Scott. So this is a very different episode for us, and you're a different sort of guest, so we are just delighted to dive into all of it with you. But
happy to be so different.
Yeah, and we have to remember to thank Rory who pointed us in your direction and got us introduced, because I think I'm really both excited to learn from you, but also to connect some of the topics that we've been going through.
How did you connect with Rory Rudiman?
She had me on her podcast it feels like a long time ago now. I think it was like 2016. 2015, Like it was a while ago.
That's a long time, even in our years. Yeah, I'd say that's a long time. So you're a UBI expert, but what's really particularly interesting is that you have figured out how to kind of be a UBI example. So in your bio, you say that you have a crowdfunded basic income. So what does that mean? How did this come about?
So I got into this back in 2013, and Patreon launched, I think like around 2013, 2014, like it was right around there where it first came out. Patreon is like a crowdfunder, Kickstarter for creators. So like you'll find a lot of YouTubers, bloggers, vloggers, artists of all kinds. They have a Patreon page, and so they enable patrons to sign up and donate like, $3 a month, $5 a month, $10 a month, whatever. And when that platform first came out, I thought, oh, well, this is like there's potential here that I could actually create and live with like my own basic income perpetually. So I could actually use it to write about it and also learn more about it by having it. And so I started that process in late 2014 and achieved my goal of over $1,000 per month in Patreon income in January 2016. And yeah, it was just, I've learned a lot having it. One of the things I've learned is it's a base, it's this foundational base. And I was surprised even how like a small amount could be beneficial in like kind of lifting a weight off my shoulders that I didn't even really know was there. Because like when you think about it, $200 a month, let's say, it's not that much. And people will say, if you were asking people about which basic income should be set at, like hardly anyone would say $200 a month. Like it's just too low. And you think, well, what can that really do? well, $200 a month is just really kind of takes that burden off your shoulders of trying to have any fear at all of being able to afford food. You know, it's like worst case scenario that can happen. You know, you lose your job, you can't get any kind of unemployment insurance or whatever. That baseline is there. You can always rely on it. And the Patreon income too is so interesting because it's distributed. So it's not like one person can say, "Oh, I'm done with you," and that's it. It's like I would have to lose, all 200 so of my patrons, and so it's this very stable income too. So it's not exactly like basic income, but it does kind of emulate it because of that distributed nature. And yeah, just one surprise that I felt was just how much like breathing room it gave, just to like not have to worry about that anymore.
Who were the people that were originally drawn to say, hey, we want to support you financially? Because I'm also trying to draw the connection with people that are building, small and basic incomes off of their Substacks or whatever. So who were the people that were originally drawn to you in this model?
Well, so again, I got into basic income in 2013, and I believe I wrote my first article. I wrote it for Medium in late 2014, or maybe early 2014, I think, somewhere around there. And so I'd already started building up somewhat of a following of people who were interested in basic income and were trying to learn from my writing and supported me through that. And then also I got a real kick in the arm, a real booster from a journalist who wrote something about me for The Atlantic, talking about that and what I was doing. And so that really helped jump the number of people who knew about me and were supporting me through that. So, and really I was lucky, just like so many other things, like how much luck can play a role. Luck definitely played a role with me too.
I imagine that a lot of people listening are maybe vaguely familiar with universal basic income, maybe from Andrew Yang talking about it a lot when he had his presidential run. That was in
2019. He was running, it would have been 2020, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know he borrowed a lot from your thinking and your writing there, and then maybe people have heard a little bit about the kind of what's going on in Alaska, which we'll get to from there, but I would imagine most people don't really know what it is. So perhaps you could just share a kind of a brief explanation of what universal basic income is and why you think it's the bee's knees.
Yeah, so I guess the dictionary definition of basic income is that it's a periodic cash payment unconditionally delivered to all on an individual basis without means test or work requirement. And so that's 5 characteristics of basic income. It's cash, and it's periodically delivered on a regular basis, and it's to individuals instead of the head of a household, and it's unconditional universal. Unconditional meaning there's no work requirement, universal meaning it's not means tested, it goes to rich and poor alike. And just those 5 things, you don't really, might not think about it as being some big change if you look at each kind of thing on its own, but altogether it's kind of a revolutionary approach to do all 5 of those things at once. But each one of those things is a way of improving the way that we currently do some program that kind of already matches those things in a lot of ways. And
I know that there's a large percentage of the population that have a little bit of an allergy to 2 of those things, right? No work requirement and no means testing.
Right.
So maybe break down a little bit why they're wrong to think that is a problem.
Yeah, so the big one is, no work requirement. People think, oh, that means it's just robbing Peter to pay Paul and be lazy.
We're all welfare queens.
Right, no one will do anything. You'll get your money and you won't work for anything else.
Right.
And we actually know from lots of other policies even that work requirements don't work. Even there was a giant kind of test that we did in the U.S. just recently with Medicaid work requirements, during COVID-ish, when I can't remember which state actually did it, but you could actually test and see this state that actually imposed work requirements and those who didn't, and lo and behold, there was no difference. And we see this over and over again, that the imposition of work requirements it never increases work. And when you remove them, it doesn't, decrease work. It's just by imposing work requirements, what you do is you just create more bureaucracy and people start not qualifying for the program. Yeah, it costs more, but also you're kicking people off. So you could say that you save money by giving it to fewer people who should qualify for it but no longer do. But what you're not doing is actually increasing any employment at all. It's not any kind of boost in that way. So you're just wasting money and leading to worse outcomes by imposing that.
And then what about the means testing? Why should, Elon Musk get universal basic income?
Yeah, this is going to be a stumbling block, especially I feel for those on the left. It's maybe they'll be more acceptable of work requirements, but then, why are we giving it to rich people? And taxes would just work so much better for a subtraction mechanism, for giving it to rich people. So don't worry about the fact that Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk will get basic income. They already get the standard deduction too, and nobody asks about that. The standard deduction is universal, but they will pay much more. Let's say if the basic income is $15,000 a year, they're going to be paying more in new taxes than $15,000, so their net is going to be a decrease. And the reason you want to do it that way is because now you don't have that test on the front end. And that front-end test means that a lot of people that you want to actually get this benefit of some kind, they don't get it. And so these means testing, this creates these obstacles and barriers that prevent people in need, in great poverty, from getting. Right now, we have 13 million people who are getting nothing, who are living in poverty. And a lot of it has to do, too, with part of that being the problems, these barriers that would create to actually qualifying for these things. So many programs that we think of as being good programs, or maybe we'll even assume that they work in a certain way, they don't work that way. So SNAP, if someone were to guess what percentage of the population who qualifies for SNAP gets it, it's around 3 out of 4 people, max. And if you look at a program, that's our best coverage program. If you look at something like temporary assistance for needing families, which is our cash welfare program, which is a block grant to states, on average, that's 1 out of 5 people who qualify for it. And then because there's state variance, there are states that have 1 out of 100 households in poverty who qualify for it. So you're talking about a 99% exclusion rate because of these means testing.
So another way to potentially accomplish kind of the same goal would be a negative income tax, right? But again, that seems like that creates a lot more overhead.
So for those who aren't familiar with the negative income tax term, this is what Milton Friedman talked about, and he actually supported both UBI and NIT. It's just so much easier just to go flat amount, and then you worry about taxes on the back end, and then that handles all the calculation after the fact.
Okay, so we've been really getting deep on kind of the how, but let's spend a little bit more time on the why. What is it that we want to be better, and why do we want that now when we think about the why for universal basic income?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many reasons for basic income, and things that I've learned just from studying it and the studies and what we've observed. So then there's philosophical arguments for it, but then there's also science-based arguments for it. I think a good philosophical argument for it is just the freedom to say no. I think that's a really powerful thing. It's saying that, look, everyone, a big problem with, say, needing a minimum wage, problem with a lot of abuse by employers, or even abuse by partners in households, in relationships, is this lack of ability to say no because you need this income. It's better than nothing. If you have this non-zero position, you have some bargaining power, and you can say, look, I don't need that job to survive, and then so therefore I'll be happy to do that job, but it needs to pay $20 an hour or something, make it worth it. And that's really should be the way things are, right? An employer should be the one creating the incentive to accept a job. But right now, we're blaming workers for saying no to a job, saying they're lazy or something, instead of the fact that maybe the wages are incredibly low, or the work environment's terrible, or it's abusive, or toxic in some way. Like, the power to say no is a big thing. And that's like real freedom. And at the same time, if freedom is important to somebody, it's interesting too, if maybe they might oppose basic income because they'll do this, this, or this with the basic income. And it's like, well, yeah, like freedom is the ability to make bad choices or make mistakes or whatever that you feel it is. But like, that's what freedom is. Like, we should all be able to make our own choices and learn from them.
Pursuit of happiness and all of that, right?
Right. And like scientific reasons for basic income, again, like my background is in psychology, and so it's really the positive psychology kind of aspect of this. Reduced stress is a big deal. And I already mentioned how much of a difference it made just by having a $200 per month basic income, was meaning that, well, I wasn't worried about like food anymore. And if you're not worried about food anymore, then that's a weight off your shoulders. And that stress that we constantly carry with us, even if we're not like constantly thinking about it, it's there. And, you know, that can lead to things like, more heart disease, even more cancer. It can lead to things like diabetes and things. Like, there are health implications to that stress. And also, you know, there's these the implications on like crime and things. Like, it's not that everyone commits a crime because they're poor or something. It's just that there's a lot of crime that's related to lack of survival income and trying to get that. And so we see this in these pilots, these saturation pilots where entire communities receive this. The Namibia pilot, crime actually went down by 42% overall. And when you're looking at like crimes of desperation, I would say a good example of that is illegal hunting. So like you're poaching endangered animals, like these kinds of things. In Namibia, that dropped 95%. So that's like a great example of like a crime where no one really wants to do it. But if like the choice is you're going to do that or not feed your family, you're going to do that. And so there's just so much crime going on because people feel that they have no really other choice. And if you have basic income, it can actually reduce that a lot and improve our health. And that leads to a lot better society, I would say.
I feel like the other piece that is more like the silent piece underneath it is really the generational trauma that comes from, you know, trying to raise families or being children in these, these vulnerable spaces, right? And if you were to remove some of that chronic stress, and if you were to remove some of that anxiety, you would probably, you know, do a lot to protect families, do a lot to protect children, and create opportunity that helps the abundant future you're trying to create as well.
Yeah, the biggest impact is always on kids. Like it's amazing to see the impact on kids, and the earlier the better. You know, so there's a great like natural experiment that's been going on since the 90s. Took place in North Carolina, and it had to do with the intersection between the beginning of Cherokee dividends for the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians and a longitudinal study of child poverty called a Smoky Mountain Study of Youth that had started a few years before that. So suddenly, about like a third of this large cohort of kids, their parents started getting this basic income. And you could see they were already studying, the plan was to study these kids for 10 years. And so now they got this ability to see what was the impact on these kids of this basic income. And yeah, just all sorts of positives from this, to the point where they're still learning from this as these kids get older and older and older. They're like in their 30s and 40s now or so. And at age 26, the amount of the money that had been distributed, the return on investment from that was already calculated as 3 to 1, based on just lower crime, better educational outcomes, better health, these kinds of things. And they saw that, yeah, the younger the kid was when they started getting it, the bigger the impact. And also if two parents were getting it instead of one, the bigger the impact.
So it's always a good idea, it seems, right? I mean, just historically, there's inequities and problems and so on. And of course, lately in the news, we're hearing a lot about job losses due to AI and, the forecasting that, perhaps we'll be at 20% unemployment or 50% unemployment. Is UBI necessary? Like, is that, will we be able to function without it? Or is this like the magic bullet that can save us all? Scott, tell us.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The prospect of automation and the impacts of that, that's what brought me into this space in the beginning from, again, back in 2013, before people were really talking about it that way. But after learning about this and getting into it, it opened my eyes to the fact that we've already been seeing the impacts of automation actually since the 1970s. Like a chart that a lot of people have seen, like it could be nicknamed the Great Decoupling, but if you've seen it, the productivity since 1973 has continued to go up. Prior to 1973, 1975, or like around mid 70s, wages and incomes kept up with productivity, and then it went flatter, not like flat, but it went flatter. And then so all of this productivity growth since the 1970s has gone essentially mostly only the top 1%. And all of these trillions have been not going to the 90% like they would have, to the point where actually it's $80 trillion now that would have gone to the bottom 90% that didn't and just went to the top 1% since then. And so when people ask me, what happens if we don't do basic income, it's more of that. We're going to get more inequality. And I would argue that we're in this political space where we are right now, not only here in the U.S., but around the world, where there's a rising authoritarianism as a result of question mark. We don't really know. But I would say that it has to do with this rising inequality. And I would say the rising inequality has a lot to do with the fact that we have not been distributing productivity growth through the growth that technology has created and made possible, computerization and everything. And so we'll just have more of that. And the question isn't, I wouldn't say like, it's less of an economic one, and I think more of like a social one. How far can we go? How unequal can we get before like we start seeing these things that we haven't seen in a while? Like the guillotines kind of thing. Like when will those kind of break out? Right, right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've said on your podcast that if we just keep giving money to Jeff Bezos, and he's at some point he's not going to be able to deliver Amazon goods to people because they don't have any money to buy it. So it's in his best interest as well, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly a business case to be made for a basic income as just being like consumption vouchers, where we all need, like if we have a 70% consumer-based economy, consumers need to have money to spend. They need to be able to signal demand, and basic income accomplishes that. I've even argued, too, that basic income actually enhances and improves markets and thereby capitalism, because people are actually able to signal demand. And right now, like how does a business succeed if, let's say, they produce a good or service and people can't afford that good or service, not because it's too expensive, but because they just have to have money for their absolute basics. Mm-hmm. And then so that business fails. And that business fails, is it because it was a bad product or service? Like, they don't know. And so if we make sure that every person has some minimum amount of ability to signal demand, then we have a much better idea of like what are the goods and services that people actually want and support versus stuff that just didn't work. And that's why I think that not only would basic income be good for like entrepreneurship, but it would be great for small businesses. It would be great for small town USA. It would be great for all these places where there's already had like this drying up of demand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so this kind of like consumption voucher or something that you said, Another one that I heard, which was from Betsy Stevenson, an economist. She was on Kara Swisher's On program recently. She was suggesting a digital dividend, which I thought sounded kind of icky, but maybe I just don't like talking about the fact that my digital footprint is being exploited. But the idea is that, hey, you know, we all are being exploited for our digital footprints, and hey, shouldn't we all get a piece of the profits that is creating, instead of it all just going to the top 0.1% or whatever. And so, like, ultimately the digital dividend, if you did it correctly, right, would be something like a UBI. So there's all these different kind of like approaches, and I'm wondering, like, putting on your psychology hat, what would be the most palatable, especially Meg and I were talking last week about, you know, working class values and how there's kind of generally a distaste for any sort of social safety net. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of like giving people free money, you know, maybe that's not so palatable, but like, as you've seen, you know, what could work from a...
Yeah. So basic income isn't welfare, and it can't be seen as welfare because, that won't work. I think dividend framing is strong, and as you've mentioned, Alaska before, that clearly works well. So in 1979, Alaska, made a huge find, lots of oil, and they decided to set up a permanent fund to make sure that, you know, even after they drilled and sold all the oil, that they just wouldn't be left with nothing. And so by actually using 25% of the revenue gained from the oil and putting it into this permanent fund, then that fund would always exist. And you invest that fund in the markets, and then that creates a revenue. It, you know, gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Those dividends are paid to everyone in Alaska. Those dividends started being paid in 1982. And they've been paid every year since. The average has been around $1,000 to $2,000 per year the entire time, and that's for everyone, rich or poor, adult and child alike. Everyone gets that dividend every year, as long as they were a resident and as long as they weren't in prison the previous year. And so the question is, you know, how's that worked? Well, first of all, I would say, they looked at the employment impact, and they found that there was a slight decrease in employment for full-time workers, but it was actually counteracted by the spending of the money, which actually created more jobs, which meant more people were able to find jobs, which then basically meant that there was zero loss or gain in full-time employment. And then overall, there was a small 7% gain in part-time employment. So that people were, you know, more able to find those part-time jobs, again, mostly through the spending of the basic income. And it's also, there was not any kind of inflationary response from this. Actually, if you look at CPI growth, comparing the state of Alaska to the rest of the contiguous U.S., CPI growth was faster prior to 1982 and then slower than the rest of the U.S. post-1982. So if you wanted to have a hypothesis that it would accelerate inflation, it did the opposite. It did not do that. And it's also had other positive effects besides, you know, increasing poverty. It also, a more recent paper showed that it's actually decreased child abuse and, reduced interactions with child protective services. So, like, more kids are staying with their parents. Things like that. Like, I think that was kind of an incredible find to see. And the fact that it's a dividend, you know, people really love it there, and they feel it's theirs. Like, that's mine. Mm-hmm. They see that because, you know, it's a question of ownership of who owns the oil, like who owns the natural resources like oil in Alaska and everywhere else. Alaska said, well, everyone should own their share equally. And so I think we should translate that to universal basic income and see that, well, like with the AI dividend, we should see it as our dividend for that technology because we were the ones who trained the AI. It's our data that made all the image generation and text generation, video generation. All of this was trained on our stuff. And also, the R&D was publicly funded too. So
And we
public
created
dollars went into this.
the stable economy under which the technology industry could grow. We created the rule of law that made it possible for these companies to be started and thrive, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot to that. I also think that there's a nuance that you find with how people see handouts versus other things, right? Like if you look at the way people see Medicare in the United States, they don't see it as universal health care or socialism. They see it as something that they paid into and are deserving of. But anything that's targeted about poor people seems to have a different connotation to it. And again, that's where all the narrative of, well, people will be lazy and they're not doing their fair share, and I work hard and they don't, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just curious. I love the fact that your tenet to really address that is to make it available for everyone. I think that does remove a pretty sizable barrier, but I still feel that there's this idea of taking agency back to the worker, to me, feels really valuable. But we in the United States have seen a real decline in unions and in anything that's sort of labor favorable or focused on making that contract of work balanced between the corporation and the worker. Any bright lights there in helping that?
So I would say, but I already mentioned UBI's power to say no. I also consider it the freedom to say yes also. And those go together. And it helps to see work through that lens too. And so with that freedom to say no, with that basic income, then it means that, let's say, a job that people find undesirable, that can pay more, so employers will need to improve conditions and stuff for people to accept those jobs. But then also it can function as a subsidy for jobs that people really like, people really enjoy, people find meaningful. So there's a lot of jobs out there that, let's say, like people who would want to be a teacher, but teachers that doesn't pay much. So then you end up doing something else. So suddenly people could actually have that basic income and have that earn, an additional $30K or something for being a teacher. And now it's actually doable. And volunteering too. So you could actually do unpaid work. And that's just not something that's possible outside of having that basic income. Or like that's why you see people who get on Social Security, they retire. And it's not that they don't start doing nothing. They actually start doing a lot of volunteering. They get politically engaged. They vote a lot more. That's why they tend to get more of what they want, because they're actually voting and being like part of this, because they can. And so, yeah, I think that it's important to see, just how much basic income could improve all these jobs in this workplace. And also unions, like that's not something that would not be impacted by this. We're talking greater bargaining power. That means individually and collectively. So if a union wants to go on strike, right now, they have to have enough money for a strike fund, and then they're always limited. Like they have to get what they hope to get their demands within, say, 3 months. That's as long as they can hold out, and maybe the employer knows that they can't last longer than 3 months. So it's really just about trying to make sure that they outlast them. But a basic income actually functions as an unlimited strike fund. So suddenly unions don't need to have that strike fund in order to go out. And they can outlast, they can't be outlasted because that money doesn't disappear. And so basic income would actually be great for unions in this environment where it is harder and harder for unions to organize, especially around the service sector and gig labor and things like that, where maybe they just can't ever make it work. But if individuals on their own have that strike power, then now you're talking about actually improving these jobs too.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to talk about trust a little bit, because I think that's such a big deal. last year, I guess it was, Meg and I went to TED, and there was a great talk by a guy named Rory Stewart. He was talking about, how there's all these philanthropic efforts throughout the world, billions, hundreds of billions of dollars spent, and they move the needle not at all. And then he gave an example of direct cash, no strings attached, and what a huge difference it made. And I'm sure you know this example. And so, I think that there's so much tied up into people thinking that you have to have like these services that are for specific reasons and for, specific topics and for specific people. And if you just give people cash, then they're going to do something naughty with it, right? And like every example points to the contrary of that we really just should trust people, and that it's actually the lack of trust that costs the most money. So I was wondering if you could share, a little bit more about what you've learned from that perspective. Like, I'm setting up the platform, but I have none of the facts. Mm-hmm. So, why should we trust people?
Yeah. People are endlessly creative, and they're also a lot like us. Like everyone out there is a lot like me in regards to the decisions that I would make. And, we tend to think of ourselves as like being super special. Like, no. All those people, they will misuse this. They'll do this, this, and this, and this. I won't. And maybe even like I made a mistake at some point and learned from that. And maybe that's why I won't make that other mistake that other people will. In which case, I'm paternalistically saying that they aren't allowed to make those mistakes and learn from them. Or maybe the mistake is just something that I was good enough to make and learn from, but they won't. It's just, distrust is at the center of this. And the best example is, people will use basic income for drugs. Like, we can't actually do cash at all. We have to do all these other services because people use cash for drugs. That's why we even have SNAP. That's why we have like food vouchers, because people use cash for drugs. Like, that's this overriding hypothesis. And it's just not true. And it's weird too how someone who, let's say, spends $2 or $3 other dollars to feel like a human being, to go out and like buy a can of beer or something, and they're not having the best time, and they just want to like escape a bit and feel a little bit better, and they get the can of beer. But if someone like goes out to a bar and spends like $100 on a nice glass of bourbon or something, like, that's totally fine. Like, that's not a mistake at all. That's good taste. But we see that the evidence shows us that when you actually provide this unconditional cash, especially if it's regular and not just one time, but it's something that they can depend upon, then drug use and addictive behavior actually goes down. We see this over and over and over and over again. This is like not only a one-time thing. It's not only a one-country thing. This is around the world. This is in the U.S. too. If you make sure that you reduce people's stress and you actually reduce the need to medicate behavior, that's what it is. Like, a lot of drinking, a lot of drug use is just like, look, I just can't stand this. I've got to like escape a little bit. I've got to, check out. And basic income really is just like enabling people to check in. Like, they're actually able to get more involved, not have to escape. And you just see that behavior go down. So when we don't trust people, like, not only do we actually increase drug use by actually making things conditional and preventing people from having this stable income, the signal coming from the politicians is, I don't trust you. And then that feeds into people not trusting government, not trusting institutions. If they don't trust me, why should I trust them? And so one of the most fascinating results of the Finland basic income experiment was increased trust, like across the board. They saw people increase trust in society, in each other, and also increase trust in institutions and politicians and government. Like, it was a double-digit increase in trust because of that. And really the only reason for that is because the government was saying, I trust you.
What was the Finland study? Just to give us a little bit of grounding, like how, or is it a permanent program or was it just a pilot?
It was the Finland experiment of basic income happened, let's see, it finished in, I think it was 2016 to 2018. The report came out in like 2020. They looked at 2,000 unemployed Finns. So it wasn't like everybody, it wasn't like a saturation pilot. They looked specifically at 2,000 unemployed Finns. And what they essentially did was remove the conditions on their unemployment scheme. So what you would usually do is get around $600 or so in US dollars comparative for being unemployed. And then in Finland, as with here too, like you only get it for being unemployed. You take a job and then you lose that money and maybe you're not all that better off. So that's like a discouraging of accepting jobs. So they wanted to see if you don't take that money away when they get a job, in which case that's a basic income floor, then what is the impact? And they found that there was a slight increase in employment, pretty small. It was like 2% or something, like very small increase in annual hours worked. But all these other positive impacts, so you had like, decreased stress and increased well-being and happiness. But I think the big one was trust. That's what we should be interested in is, what can actually increase trust in societies and governments, because we're facing this just complete breakdown in trust in institutions. And I think part of it is just the way people are being treated.
But did they stop doing this? And because
it was just a 2-year pilot.
Yeah. Well, because it's sort of maybe coincidental, but in Scott Galloway's recent like Monday newsletter, the big stat of the day was that Finland has the highest trust in society at 90% or something like that. So I was like, oh my gosh, but I don't know, maybe there were just incredible
it went up more
from this one little pilot.
Yeah, but you see that otherwise too. It's interesting. Multiple studies have studied the impact of basic income on trust. And from what I can tell, it's that you don't see an increase in trust in government if the program is not government funded. And so if it's like a charitable program, say run in some city, it's a small thing, and it's just a charity is in charge of it, there's no increase in trust in government. But it's even seen from like Alaska, you can see an increase in trust in government. And any like other program that's looked at that, if it's a government program, you see that same thing.
So a couple years back, I remember there was like this big outrage about poor people have microwaves and refrigerators and
right, the refrigerators,
right? And this was just like evidence that people spent money poorly, which obviously any thinking person would take a little bit of issue with that maybe that what that meant was poor people live in the modern world the same as the rest of us and navigate that world in a very similar way. So back to your point about the fact that we hold these two sorts of strange things. We think that the world is exactly as it is for us, for most people, but yet we somehow also see ourselves as special or unique, and that there's a range of people that are maybe less honorable than us and maybe less deserving than us and maybe more lazy than us and all of these other things. What would be the thing that you would hope for as you start to get more people on board with not only the context of UBI, but really the kind of heart underneath that of how do we collectively start not just trust, but start seeing the best in both people and the future, and how can we leverage that belief to kind of bring more people along with us into this place that hopefully is, if not more abundant, maybe less awful for a good percentage. Because I think as I stare down the future of work and this thing about the opportunity to say no and the kind of agency that you're hoping for, I see that left unchecked, we're kind of head in the opposite direction, much less agency and much less opportunity and much more scarcity and even more sense of threat that starts to vilify people for being able to prepare food, so like, how do we change the narrative in a way that works for everybody?
That's the $15,000 a year question, I feel. So what brought me into basic income in the first place was this novella called Manna by Marshall Brain. And I thought it was a real clever design just in as a work of fiction, where the first half of the book was really just kind of extending the way that we're going to its logical conclusion. And that logical conclusion was, well, we're not going to do basic income, so instead we're going to end up like housing the unemployed and the poor in like camps and like buildings full of where they're just stuck out there in the middle of nowhere because they're no good anymore, and we're just not going to kill them, but we're just going to like leave them out there, and all their basic needs are covered. They've got food and housing and stuff, but like that's all. We're just going to shove them over here, and that's that. Just internment camps for the homeless, basically. And I was raised as a fan of Star Trek, and just like this, the world can be a better place. And I miss like the fiction that we used to have more of, I feel, of like how great things could be. And so the second half of this was like, what if we actually use technology to actually do the best things that we could? Like you switch to a resource-based economy where, you're thinking like, well, we have this resource, we have this amount of resource, we have this technology, we have this people. How do we actually create massive abundance? So like, it's more like Star Trek. And that question, that really got me worried because, I was thinking we are going in the bad direction, and I want to go in the Star Trek direction. And the author believed that the key to that was basic income, which got me looking into this. And I think that's a really key part of it, is just like thinking that we do want to go to that better place, and we actually can do it. It's possible. It's like we suffer from a collective lack of will and imagination. It's not like economics holding us back. We could have started a UBI decades ago. We can actually do all kinds of things better than we're doing now. But massive inequality leads to a lot of these breakdowns, and that's what's getting worse and worse. So it's even a feedback loop too. Like as inequality increases, then you can either look up and look at like the billionaires as like the problem and like this concentration of wealth, and maybe it's not even like their fault, but like the system itself is creating the structure where there's people with like almost everything compared to everyone else who has relatively nothing compared to them. And if you're in the position of the working class, then who do you look at? Do you look up for your problems, or do you look down? And this is even like a physiological thing. Like this is an entirely valid way of reducing your stress as a human being, is to actually bully downwards. Because then you're at the top. You're at the top of your own little like pyramid. As long as you get enough people below you and instill order and control and stuff below you. And that's where we're going. You look at a lot of the anti-immigrant sentiment, like a lot of that is this stress-induced like bullying behavior as part of it. You're always trying to figure out what are the outgroups. You just aren't looking up, and it gets harder and harder to do that. To a point, because again, like there just seems to be, there's a breaking point, and I don't want us to get to that point. Like I do not want us to be stretched so far that we start seeing like social breakdown and all sorts of like violence and things. We can avoid that, and we should avoid that. And I think this is a key to doing that. And like part of it is just saying, well, we can. These are just political choices that can be made. We can do that. We all have a vote, And even though, money can influence that, it still all comes down to what our decision is, like in the voting booth.
Yeah. I think my big aha moment in this conversation was this concept of the dividend, right? And it's just such a different framing. But if we can have everyone in society be in a profit sharing mode of everything that's going well in the economy, so far anyway, hopefully, then, people should be able to participate in that profit sharing.
Another part of it too is inheritance. And that's what I didn't touch on yet, is that, dividend is one part of it. We should see it as a dividend. But also, we have to look back decades and even centuries. As human beings, we're part of a project that's like standing on shoulders. And so, it doesn't make sense for Elon Musk to become like the world's first trillionaire based on standing on shoulders of all these people who are no longer with us. And essentially, he becomes the inheritor of humankind's knowledge when it comes to technology, what made AI possible and things. Does that make sense that he should be the inheritor alone of all of this? And that goes to land too. Thomas Paine's argument back in the late 1700s, he wasn't talking about universal basic income, he was talking about something close, which is everyone would have gotten a capital grant at age 21. It would have been a universal capital grant. His reasoning was that, when we created private property, when we created that ability to own land, then we actually made some people worse off, because before that it was free. You could just claim land somewhere, you could farm it and till it, whatever, you can live off the land, you can hunt and scavenge for berries and that kind of thing. But as soon as we made private property, then for some people it made things worse. And so he referred to that as the disinheritance, that we lost that natural inheritance. We were the dispossessed of that natural inheritance. So not only should we see this technology as being something that we should get a dividend from, but we should look at all natural resources, all land, all knowledge, everything that we've ever created over the centuries as being something that we should all inherit to some degree, to some fair share degree. And right now we're not doing that. Instead, the trillionaires are going to inherit it.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So if someone wanted to philanthropize, hear me, okay, give money. We'll say give money to in some sort of effort where you're giving cash with no strings attached. Where should they give?
So I founded the Income to Support All Foundation. It's a foundation for short. For those who might hopefully catch what that means too, that's the double meaning is that universal basic income is a foundation. It's a foundation. When people ask me what is basic income, I often say it's a foundation. So we're working on projects that are focused on the direct implementation of basic income. One of our projects being Commingle, that's in development. The goal of that is to hopefully just create this basic income base that anyone can be a part of. Hopefully they would want to be a part of it even as they, join, say a GoFundMe. Right now you've got to find stories and you say, I want to help this person, I want to help this person. I want to automate that. So basically you can donate and then that will be sent in, small increments to everybody universally without work requirements who is part of that system. And so it's not available yet. We're working on that, but that's our goal, is to basically create a mechanism so that some billionaire could actually distribute their money through, hopefully to millions of people all at once very easily, whereas right now that's very difficult to do. And right now, Give Directly is also doing some great stuff too. Most of their stuff is overseas. But they also do some stuff here. They had a great program that they launched that they spun up when SNAP was shut down. So like people could actually get money directly to SNAP recipients in the form of these debit cards. So close, not universal, but unconditional and cash. And I really supported, them doing that. It was highly useful.
And what about any bills or anything coming up in Congress or whatever that people should know about?
There was a bill that was just reintroduced recently that would create a nationwide, or at least a large national-based basic income experiment. I can't remember the exact name of the bill. I think it's just like the Guaranteed Income Pilot Act or something like that.
But you didn't love it, right? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I support anything like this because it's good to just get money to people in a way without, conditions and helps like show those stories and everything. But when it comes to details, I think it's really important that it goes to every member of a household, and that wouldn't do that. And also we have really tested this. It's already very, very tested. There's already been 160 pilots in the U.S., mostly since COVID, all around the country. Like we know we have the data. And so a lot of this to me is more a way of kicking the can down the road.
Right.
Like if you set up a new 3-year pilot, now you don't have to implement basic income for 3 years. You don't have to worry about any kind of basic income bill at the national level because you're still waiting for that data to come in, Right. Like who knows what's going to happen.
It encourages indecisiveness and
Yeah, and we're at a place right now where I really expect the impacts of AI and stuff to really start biting more than it already is. Like I think we're seeing some right now in the entry-level job sectors. I think people right out of college are having a harder time right now. And if you're losing your job right now, I think it's harder to find people because all these companies are like, how do we leverage our existing workforce and using AI to not have to hire anybody? So 3 years from now, I think we're going to be in a place where there's going to be a lot worse stuff going on in regards to the job market. And we shouldn't be waiting for, another 2,000, 3,000 person pilot or whatever to do something.
Thank you so much, Scott, for both educating us and giving us hope and helping orient our energy to what needs to happen next. I found it really valuable.
This was amazing. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
All right, Meg, you ready for Leadership Corner?
I am. Let's Leadership Corner.
All right, let's do it. Here we go. I'm well into my corporate career and completely burned out from constant layoffs, reorganizations, and trying to build trust and confidence with my team despite everything going on around us. I see people like the two of you who've built portfolio careers and wonder if I could do the same. But I have a mortgage and kids. How do you know when you've had enough to save up to make the leap? And what if I'm not as ambitious or satisfied without the big corporate energy?
Well, you're asking all the right questions for sure. First off, I think that you owe it to yourself to address a little bit of the burnout. And I think regardless of what you do next, like you do not want to be taking the burnout energy with you. And while I respect your belief that you have burnout because of the weight that comes from a corporate job, I encourage you to give yourself a little bit more agency over that. And what I mean by that is most of the time it's the gap between your expectations and the reality that is the problem. And so I would encourage you to ask yourself, are your expectations somewhat unrealistic, and why would that be? Like, were you not really reading the full situation of the reality of your current situation? And I think that's important because whatever you do next will have both ups and downs. And so being a little bit honest with yourself about where the hard bits are and where the fun bits are, I think sets you up for better management of your energy, which is the key to everything. So I think that is important. But as it relates to a portfolio life, and I will let Amy talk a little bit more about this because she's the master of this, and I'm a little bit behind her on that.
Yeah.
I will say that you're absolutely asking the right questions, having a really good handle on what your non-negotiable costs are, what your real costs are is an important part of it. And I would give myself a running start into moving to portfolio. You will notice I took my board seat a couple years before I stepped out of full-time corporate. And so I already had some things in motion as it related to doing more portfolio type work. But it isn't anywhere close. I mean, you have to cover your own healthcare. You have to cover, expenses at full cost. And, so you really are making a very different economic choice. And it's, tied to what do you want your lifestyle to be and what do you want where do you want to spend your energy and where do you want to give your contribution? Which gets to the last part of your question, which is, am I going to have enough substance in a portfolio life that really helps me feel that I'm contributing to my fullest level? And again, I think this is where spending time to map out how do you want to contribute and what do you want that to look like will matter a lot. Because for me, I do struggle with this. I need a lot of engagement and a lot of intellectual stimulation. And so things like starting a podcast were great places for me to put my energy. But without that, I would probably be feeling a lot more strain on that side. So I think you can create those things for yourself in different ways and different modalities, but they're not going to happen accidentally. So having a really good inventory of where and how you want to spend your time and what is the right balance and how would you know? What would it feel like? What would it look like if you were at the right balance for you? And again, no one can answer these questions for you. You have to answer them for yourself. But these all are pieces to that question. So I will let Amy talk a little bit about the financial planning side of it. And
yeah, I get these kind of questions a lot. And they come in the form of like, well, are you satisfied? Are you bored? Like, is it enough? So that's one. And then the other is like, oh gosh, I wish I could do that, but I just like, it's really scary because of healthcare, because of college tuition, et cetera. Right. So, and those are real reasonable fears. And so, first off, in terms of the financial security, we've talked about that a lot. And yeah, you need to feel financially secure, but there are ways to do that. So there are ways to, save aggressively, while you're in the corporate environment, and you can save in things like, your HSA to, counteract healthcare costs later. We do still have ACA, so it is possible to not have a job and have healthcare and not be yet 65 years old. So that is possible. Now, it's also possible that ACA could go away. So that's very scary. But, is it a situation where you'll never have a job again? Like, could you still contribute to society in a different way and have the door open to a corporate job later on? So these are things that you need to be thinking about. But regardless, I would say save aggressively, save for HSA, things like, all of those things that could make this possible for yourself, right? That being able to have the choice is the best psychological thing that you can do. Now, in terms of, gosh, would I be bored? I'm an ambitious person. What would I be without my big job? And this was something that I pondered quite a bit, actually, because, more than anything, I felt like my purpose was to lead, to be a role model, to, create successful, cohesive teams that deliver great outcomes, and to mentor and support people coming up into the world. And doing that in a big job with a giant team and lots of big outcomes was a great way to do it. But it wasn't the only way to do it. And so, it took a little bit of figuring out for me whether I really could bring that purpose to in other directions. And I'm happy to say that I can. So, first of all, I have my product desires and my wanting to do product strategy, to, get my hands dirty and build stuff. And it's a super fun time, actually, because there's vibe coding. So I can do vibe coding, and I've got my advisory clients that I can work with. And so that's super fun. But of course, that's separate from my purpose, which is around bringing up people. And so I think the podcast and our ability to do these leadership corners, to have, regular mentoring conversations. One of the reasons why we did these leadership corners really was because Meg and I are often pinged by, former colleagues and employees and people that we know to go to lunch and have a little career chat. So that was kind of why we did these, because we thought that it could be a little bit more universally useful. So I find lots of purpose and lots of possibility. To wrap up, I would say, give yourself the financial security that you need to be able to make the choices. If you find yourself either, getting laid off or in some sort of position where you kind of have to do something different, please believe in yourself that this is a great thing to do. It's not, it's not a bad thing. It's a huge opportunity for you to actually live your purpose and do it in a way that is right for you.
I definitely want to double down on bet on yourself. You believe in yourself and your ability to do it. And then maybe read the book, Everything is Figure Outable, and decide if it's important for you, then figure it out, because you can do that.
And maybe the book Ikigai, about the Japanese concept of purpose. And vote and support dividends or basic income or what have you, so that people have these options to pursue their purpose.
Absolutely. I was going to say something similar, that if there's one thing that's clear, is, at least to me, is that the future that we need isn't going to create itself. We have to help make it happen. And I do agree, Rory Rudiman is on the right track and has set us on the right track, that this universal basic income, universal dividend, however we want to talk about it, is an important piece in helping us create a future that gives more options and more flexibility to all of us. So yeah, let's make that happen. And I really believe in this group and in our audience to help us figure it out. So let's invent the future together, everyone. I believe in us.
Let's make every day count.